Hey guys, tonight we begin with America's wealthiest daughters, dripping in diamonds, traded like cattle to bankrupt European aristocrats, desperate for cash. While Hollywood loves its Cinderella stories, the real Gilded Age tale is Cinderella in reverse. The princess gets locked in a tower, and the prince gets her credit card. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of American heiresses marrying European royalty, you probably imagine a fairy tale. Grand balls, romantic proposals, castles, tiaras happily ever after. You might picture a lucky girl living every little girl's dream of becoming a real princess. But here is what actually happened. Imagine being 18 years old, locked in your bedroom by your own mother, sobbing hysterically, while downstairs your mum negotiates your marriage contract like she is selling a racehorse. Except the racehorse probably got better treatment. Between 1870 and 1914, over 500 American girls, most of them barely out of childhood, were shipped off to Europe in what was essentially the world's most expensive mail-order bride system. Cash for coronets, they called it. The American families got titles to brag about. The European aristocrats got enough money to fix their leaky castles. And the daughters, they got to spend the rest of their lives freezing in drafty British mansions, married to men who saw them as walking ATMs thousands of miles from home, trapped in a life they never wanted. Congratulations, you are a duchess. Hope you like being miserable in 14 different languages. Picture yourself as a young woman growing up in New York City in 1895. Your father is a Vanderbilt, an Astor, a Morgan, one of the titans who built modern America. You live in a mansion on Fifth Avenue that cost more to construct than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes. You have never worried about money because money in your world is as abundant and constant as air. You have been raised by nannies and governesses. You speak French fluently because it is the language of sophistication. You've been trained in music, art, literature, all the accomplishments expected of a refined young lady. You know how to enter a room, how to sit, how to hold a teacup, how to make polite conversation without ever saying anything of substance. You are, by every measure your society recognizes, a perfect product. And that is exactly what you are, a product waiting to be sold. Your mother has been planning your future since before you could walk. Not your happiness, not your dreams, your marriage. Because in the brutal social mathematics of Gilded Age America, no amount of money can buy you acceptance into old society. The Astors, the Livingstons, the other families who trace their American lineage back generations, they look down on your father's new money. They call him a robber baron. They whisper about how he made his fortune through ruthless business practices that destroyed competitors and exploited workers. They accept his donations to museums and charities, but they don't invite your family to their most exclusive events. You are rich beyond measure, but you are not, in the eyes of New York's old guard, truly elite. But your mother has a plan. If you can't buy your way into American high society, you can buy your way into something even better, European aristocracy. A duke needs money to maintain his crumbling estate. You need a title. It is a simple transaction, really. Your millions in exchange for his coronet. You become a duchess, and suddenly those American families who snubbed your mother are clamoring for invitations to your wedding. The irony is perfect. The very society that rejected you now treats you like royalty, because you're about to become actual royalty. But here is what nobody tells you as you are being fitted for your trousseau. As your mother is negotiating the marriage settlement like a business contract, as your father is arranging to transfer millions of dollars to a man you've met perhaps 3 times. Nobody tells you that you are not gaining a title, you are losing yourself. Nobody mentions that European aristocratic marriages operate under completely different rules than American ones. Nobody warns you that the moment you say, "I do," you become property in a way that even your extensive legal protections can't fully prevent. And nobody, absolutely nobody, asks if this is what you want. Let's talk about Consuelo Vanderbilt, because her story is both exceptional in its details and absolutely typical in its arc. Consuelo was born in 1877 into one of America's wealthiest families. Her grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, built a shipping and railroad empire worth an estimated $100 million, which in today's money would be over $2.5 billion. Consuelo grew up in palaces, not mansions, palaces. Her mother, Alva, commissioned a 665th Avenue NU mansion modelled after a French chateau that cost $3 million to build in 1883. That is roughly $90 million in today's money. For a single house, Consuelo was beautiful, dark-haired with delicate features and a slender figure that was considered the ideal of the era. She was also intelligent, educated, and by all accounts, a kind and thoughtful person. And she was in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and he was handsome, charming, and from a respectable American family, not as wealthy as the Vanderbilts, but certainly not poor. Consuelo wanted to marry him, but Consuelo's wants were irrelevant, because Alva Vanderbilt had other plans. Alva had identified the perfect match for her daughter, Charles Spencer, Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was young, titled, and came with one of England's most historic estates, Blenheim Palace. He was also broke. Blenheim was falling apart. The roof leaked. The vast estate was hemorrhaging money. The Duke needed an infusion of American cash, and he needed it desperately. Alva needed a title for her daughter. It was, from both sides, a purely financial arrangement. Imagine you are Consuelo, 18 years old, in love with someone else, being told that you will marry a duke you barely know. You try to resist. You tell your mother you love Winthrop. Your mother tells you that love is irrelevant. You say you won't do it. Your mother locks you in her room, not metaphorically, literally locks you in. According to Consuelo's own autobiography, written decades later, Alva kept her imprisoned in her bedroom, crying and begging to be released, while Alva negotiated the marriage terms. Alva told Consuelo that if she refused to marry the Duke, the stress would kill Alva, that Consuelo would be responsible for her mother's death. Can you imagine that psychological manipulation? Your mother, the person who is supposed to protect you, telling you that your refusal to marry a stranger will murder her. Consuelo gave in. What choice did she have? In 1895, at 18 years old, she married the Duke of Marlborough in a wedding that was described as the social event of the decade. The ceremony took place at St. Thomas Church in New York City. Consuelo wore a dress that cost $6,720, which is about $240,000 today. The train was 5 yards long, made of white satin embroidered with seed pearls. She carried a bouquet of orchids and lilies of the valley. According to witnesses, she looked like a princess from a fairy tale. She also looked, according to those same witnesses, like she was attending a funeral, because in a way, she was. She was burying the life she might have had, the love she might have known, the person she might have become. The marriage settlement was extraordinary even by Gilded Age standards. Consuelo brought a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, which generated an annual income of $100,000. That is roughly $75 million in today's money as a dowry, generating about $3 million a year in income. The Duke would control all of it. Consuelo would have no access to her own money. In addition, Alva promised to pay for all the renovations to Blenheim Palace. Estimates suggest she ultimately spent another $2 million restoring the Duke's ancestral home. So essentially, the Vanderbilts paid approximately $4.5 million, roughly $135 million in today's currency, to buy their daughter a title. And what did Consuelo get in return? She got to be the Duchess of Marlborough. She got to live in a palace so vast and cold that even with dozens of fireplaces, she was perpetually freezing. She got a husband who was, by her own later account, cold, controlling, and interested in her only for her money. She got to produce 2 heirs to secure the succession, after which the Duke essentially ignored her. She got to spend decades in a loveless marriage, trapped by social expectations and legal constraints that made divorce nearly impossible. She got homesickness so profound that she would weep when she received letters from America. She got to watch from across the ocean as Winthrop Rutherford, the man she loved, eventually married someone else. But let's step back from Consuelo's specific story for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because she was far from alone. Between 1870 and 1914, over 500 American heiresses married into European aristocracy. According to research by historian Maureen Montgomery, these women brought an estimated $220 million in dowries to their aristocratic husbands. That is roughly $6.6 billion in today's money. Think about that for a second. American industrialists essentially paid billions of dollars to European aristocrats to marry their daughters. It was one of the largest financial transfers in history, and the women themselves were merely the mechanism of transfer. Who were these women? They came from families whose names you'd recognize: Vanderbilts, Astors, Goulds, Morgans, Carnegies, the daughters of railroad tycoons, steel magnates, banking empires, industrial fortunes. Women like Mary Leiter, daughter of a Chicago department store owner, who became Lady Curzon, Viceroy of India, like Jenny Jerome, daughter of a New York financier who married Lord Randolph Churchill and became the mother of Winston Churchill, like Anna Gould, daughter of railroad magnate Jay Gould, who married first a French count and then a French duke, enduring scandal and divorce in the process. Like May Goelet, heiress to a New York real estate fortune, who married the 8th Duke of Roxburgh. Each of these women had her own story, her own struggles, her own accommodations to a life she hadn't chosen. But the pattern was remarkably consistent. American money, European title, unhappy marriage. Because here is the thing about these transactional marriages: they were business arrangements, and the business was rarely conducive to love or even basic compatibility. The aristocratic husbands married for money. The American heiresses, or more accurately their parents, married for social status. Neither party was marrying for affection, shared values, or mutual respect. Is it any wonder that so many of these marriages were miserable? Think about the specific mechanics of how these marriages came about. There was actually a system for it. American mothers with unmarried daughters would bring them to London for the season. The annual series of balls, dinners, and social events where the British aristocracy mingled. But breaking into this world wasn't easy if you were American nouveau rich, so a cottage industry developed professional matchmakers, many of them American expatriates who had married into European society themselves, would broker introductions between wealthy American girls and impoverished European aristocrats. For a fee, of course. These matchmakers operated with astonishing cynicism, according to research by historian Eric Homburger at the University of East Anglia. They would literally create catalogues. On one side, lists of American heiresses with estimates of their worth. On the other side, lists of titled European bachelors with details of their financial situations. The matchmakers would identify promising combinations and arrange introductions. It was matrimonial shopping, and everyone involved knew it. The young women being paraded in front of potential husbands understood that they were being evaluated based on their dowries. The aristocratic suitors were equally transparent about needing money. There was very little pretense of romance. Imagine you are one of these young heiresses at a London ball. You are wearing a dress that cost thousands of dollars. Your jewellery could feed a working-class family for years. You've been trained since childhood in the arts of refinement. You speak multiple languages. You can discuss literature, music, art. You are, by the standards of your era, a remarkably accomplished young woman, and you are standing in a ballroom, knowing that every aristocratic man who asks you to dance is mentally calculating whether your dowry is large enough to be worth the inconvenience of marrying an American. You are not a person to them. You are a potential source of income. Your feelings, your dreams, your personality, all of that is secondary to the question of how much money you bring. Now let's talk about what happened after the wedding, because that is where the fairy tale really fell apart. You are shipped off to your new husband's estate in England, France, or Italy. You are away from your family, your friends, everything familiar. You are in a foreign country where you are considered an outsider, an American interloper who bought her way into a title she doesn't deserve. The servants in your own house look down on you. The neighbouring aristocratic families are polite to your face and dismissive behind your back. Your husband, having secured your dowry, now has very little interest in you personally. And here is where the legal and social structures of European aristocracy really trapped these women. In England, under the laws of coverture that prevailed during most of the Gilded Age, a married woman's property became her husband's property. Yes, there were some legal protections, settlements and trusts that prevented the husband from completely squandering the wife's fortune, but control of the money went to the husband. The wife had an allowance from her own fortune. If she wanted to buy anything significant, if she wanted to travel, if she wanted to give money to her family, she had to ask her husband's permission to spend her own money. The social constraints were even tighter. Divorce was scandalous, but it was particularly scandalous for titled women. If you were a duchess and you divorced your duke, you lost your title, you lost your social position, and you'd be ostracized by both British aristocratic society and, quite possibly, American high society as well, because you'd be a divorced woman, which was barely more respectable than being a criminal. So even if your marriage was miserable, even if your husband was unfaithful, cruel, or simply indifferent, you were stuck. Social pressure and legal constraints created a cage more secure than any prison. Let's return to Consuelo Vanderbilt for a moment, because her story illustrates these dynamics perfectly. For the first few years of her marriage, Consuelo tried to make it work. She fulfilled her primary duty by producing two sons, John in 1897 and Ivor in 1898. Securing the ducal succession, she threw herself into the role of Duchess, managing Blenheim Palace, engaging in charity work, hosting elaborate parties. She tried to find purpose and meaning in a life that had been chosen for her, but the Duke was cold and often cruel. He made it clear that he had married her for her money, not for herself. He controlled every aspect of her life, from how she spent her time to who she could see. According to Consuelo's autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952, the Duke once told her explicitly that he had never loved her and had married her only for her money. Can you imagine hearing that from your husband? The man you were forced to marry, giving up the person you actually loved, now confirming that yes, it was all just a financial transaction and you were the commodity being bought. The psychological impact must have been devastating. You are trapped in a foreign country, in a loveless marriage, raising children in a house that feels like a beautiful prison, and your husband doesn't even pretend to care about you as a person. Consuelo endured this for years. She had affairs, as did the Duke. This was relatively common in aristocratic marriages of the era. If the marriage was understood to be a business arrangement, then romantic and sexual fulfillment were sought elsewhere, discreetly. Consuelo's most significant relationship was with a French aviator named Jacques Balsan, but even this relationship was constrained by her position. She couldn't be openly with him. She couldn't divorce the Duke without losing everything. She was stuck. The situation finally changed in 1906 when Consuelo and the Duke separated, and in 1921 they finally divorced. But look at the timeline. Consuelo married in 1895. She separated in 1906. After 11 years of misery, she divorced in 1921, 26 years after her forced marriage. That is over 2 decades of her life spent in a situation she'd never wanted, married to a man who'd never loved her, trapped by social conventions and legal structures. She was finally able to marry Jacques Balsan in 1921 when she was 44 years old. She'd lost her youth, her prime years, to a marriage that was a transaction from the start. And even after the divorce, Consuelo faced consequences. She lost her title. She was no longer the Duchess of Marlborough, just Mrs. Balsan. Some of the social circles that had welcomed her as a duchess now shunned her as a dvork. The very society her mother had sacrificed Consuelo's happiness to access now turned its back on her. The title, the thing that had been worth millions of dollars and a lifetime of misery, evaporated the moment she claimed her freedom. But Consuelo's story, as tragic as it is, actually had a relatively positive ending compared to some of her peers. She eventually found happiness with Jacques Balsan. She wrote her memoirs, telling her story in her own words. She lived to be 87, dying in 1964, having outlived both the Duke of Marlborough and the Gilded Age society that had shaped her fate. Some of the other dollar princesses, as these American heiresses were called, weren't so fortunate. Take the case of Mary Minnie Stevens, who married Arthur Paget in 1878. Minnie was the daughter of a wealthy American hotelier. Arthur Paget was a younger son of a British aristocratic family, which meant he had the social status but no title and limited income. Minnie brought substantial wealth to the marriage. Arthur brought social connections, but the marriage was unhappy almost from the start. Arthur was frequently unfaithful. Minnie, trapped in a foreign country with limited recourse, threw herself into charity work and social activity. She became known for her lavish parties and her wit. But privately, according to her letters and those of her friends, she was desperately unhappy. She developed health problems that were likely stress-related. She died in 19, having spent 41 years in a marriage that had brought her social status and deep personal misery. Or consider the case of Helena Zimmerman, daughter of a Cincinnati railroad and oil magnate. In 1900, she married the 9th Duke of Manchester. The Duke was an alcoholic and a gambler who went through Helena's fortune with stunning speed. He was also abusive. Helena's life became a nightmare of financial stress and personal violence. The Duke's gambling debts mounted. Helena's family had to keep sending money to cover his losses and maintain the estate. The psychological and physical toll on Helena was immense. She developed severe anxiety and health problems. The marriage limped along until the Duke's death in 1947, by which time Helena had spent 47 years in a relationship that had drained her financially, emotionally, and physically. These weren't isolated cases. Research by Professor Maureen E. Montgomery shows that a significant percentage of these dollar princess marriages were characterized by infidelity, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse. The American heiresses found themselves in foreign countries, isolated from their support networks, married to men who viewed them as walking checkbooks. The power dynamics were heavily skewed against them. The husbands controlled the money, had the social status, understood the local customs and legal systems. The wives were outsiders, Americans in European society, women in a patriarchal system, and often quite young when they married, sometimes still teenagers. The age gap was often significant and concerning. Many of these aristocratic husbands were considerably older than their American brides. It wasn't uncommon for a man in his 30s or 40s to marry a girl of 17 or 18. The power imbalance was staggering. A young American girl, however wealthy, however well-educated, was no match for a titled European aristocrat with decades more life experience, complete control over her fortune, and the backing of an entire social system designed to maintain male authority. Think about the wedding night. This is something that is rarely discussed in polite histories, but it is a crucial part of understanding these women's experiences. You are 18 years old. You've been raised in a Victorian society that treats female sexuality as shameful and dangerous. You've received little to no education about sex. You've been married to a man you barely know, possibly don't love, maybe actively fear. And now you are expected to perform wifely duties with this stranger. For many of these young women, the wedding night was traumatic. They had no knowledge, no agency, no ability to refuse. Marital rape wasn't legally recognized. A husband had conjugal rights to his wife's body, and she had no recourse if he chose to exercise those rights forcefully. The expectation was clear: produce an heir and a spare, 2 sons to secure the succession. After that, if you were lucky, your husband would leave you alone and pursue his pleasures elsewhere. If you were unlucky, he would continue to demand his rights while also being unfaithful. Many of these marriages were characterized by husbands who kept mistresses openly, flaunting their affairs while expecting their wives to remain chaste and above reproach. The double standard was absolute and unquestioned. Pregnancy and childbirth in this era were dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were significant. These young women were expected to risk their lives to produce heirs for family lines they hadn't been born into, to secure successions for titles that had been purchased with their money, and they did it again and again. Some of them had difficult pregnancies, traumatic births, health complications that lasted the rest of their lives, all in service of a marriage they hadn't wanted and a family that treated them as breeding stock. Let's talk about Alva Vanderbilt again, because her role in this system is both typical and particularly disturbing. Alva forced her daughter into a miserable marriage. But why? Was she a monster? Or was she a product of her time, doing what she genuinely believed was best for her daughter? The answer is probably both. Alva herself had married for money, or more accurately, her family had arranged her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt to merge 2 wealthy families. Her own marriage was unhappy. William was frequently unfaithful. Alva eventually divorced him in 1895, a scandalous move that shocked society. But before the divorce, while she was still playing by society's rules, she married off her daughter. Alva believed that social status was worth any sacrifice. She had clawed her way into the upper echelons of New York society through sheer determination and massive spending. She built palaces, threw lavish parties, forced the old money families to acknowledge her, but there were limits to what even her wealth could achieve. A title, especially a ducal title, was the ultimate status symbol. It proved that the Vanderbilts weren't just rich, they were royalty, or at least Consuelo was. The irony is that Alva, who had divorced her own husband to find happiness, denied her daughter the chance to marry for love. Alva, who later in life became a suffragist and fought for women's rights, had earlier sold her daughter like property. People are complicated. Alva was shaped by a society that told her status mattered more than happiness, that a daughter's duty was obedience, that a mother's job was to secure the best possible match regardless of the emotional cost. She did what her society told her was right, and she destroyed her daughter's happiness in the process. And Consuelo wasn't the only Vanderbilt daughter sacrificed to this system. Gertrude Vanderbilt, Consuelo's cousin, married Harry Payne Whitney in what was considered a love match by Gilded Age standards, but even that marriage was carefully arranged between 2 wealthy families. Barbara Rutherford Vanderbilt married another wealthy heir. The Vanderbilt daughters were all, to varying degrees, pawns in family strategies for maintaining and increasing status. Some were lucky enough to find compatibility with their arranged spouses. Others, like Consuelo, were not. Now let's widen the lens even further and look at what this system reveals about Gilded Age America, because these dollar princess marriages are a window into the values and anxieties of the era. The United States in the late 1800s was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. Industrialization was creating massive fortunes. Men who had started with nothing were becoming millionaires, even by the standards of the time when $1 million meant something truly staggering. But American society had a problem. How do you organize a social hierarchy in a country that is theoretically based on equality? Old money families, the ones whose wealth dated back generations, created an artificial aristocracy. They had their own rules, their own clubs, their own markers of status. They looked down on the newly rich industrialists. It didn't matter how much money you had. If you couldn't trace your lineage back to the right families, if your wealth was too obviously new, you were excluded. This drove the nouveau rich crazy. They had more money than the old families, but they couldn't buy acceptance. So they bought something better, European titles. If you couldn't be accepted by the Astors, you could become a duchess and force the Astors to bow to you. It was a brilliant end run around American snobbery. European aristocrats were more than happy to participate. They had titles and social status, but many of them were broke. The old estates were expensive to maintain. The traditional sources of aristocratic wealth, land and agricultural rents, were declining in an industrializing world. Meanwhile, American millionaires had more money than they could spend. A marriage between an impoverished duke and a wealthy American heiress solved problems for both families. The duke got money, the American family got a title. Everyone won, except, of course, the young woman in the middle, because here is what is really disturbing about this system. Both sides, the American parents and the European aristocrats, understood that the marriage was a financial transaction. They negotiated it like a business deal. There were contracts specifying exactly how much money would be transferred, what income would be guaranteed, what properties would be maintained. The marriage settlements for these unions were complex legal documents drawn up by expensive lawyers. Every detail was specified, except the happiness of the bride. That was never mentioned in the contracts. These young women understood what was happening to them. They weren't stupid. They could see the negotiations. They knew they were being sold. Some of them went along willingly, seduced by the glamour of a title, or resigned to doing their duty. Others, like Consuelo, fought and were forced, but all of them paid a price. Even the ones who ended up in reasonably happy marriages had still been denied the basic dignity of choosing their own partners. Even the ones who liked their husbands had still been treated as commodities. The transaction might have turned out well, but it was still a transaction. Let's talk about some of the women who tried to make the best of bad situations. May Gilded, who married the 8th Duke of Roxburgh in 1903, brought a dowry estimated at $11 million, roughly $330 million in today's money. That was one of the largest dowries of the era. The Duke got to restore his ancestral castle. May got to be a duchess. By all accounts, the marriage wasn't particularly warm, but it was cordial. May threw herself into her role, managing the estate, engaging in charity work, raising her children. She made the best of a situation she hadn't chosen, but photographs of her from the period show a woman who looks tired, older than her years, burdened. She lived until 1937, spending 34 years as the Duchess of Roxburgh. When she died, one obituary described her as having done her duty. Think about that. Her life summed up as having done her duty, not having been happy, not having fulfilled her dreams, having done her duty. Or consider Nancy Langhorne, who became Lady Astor. Nancy was from Virginia, and while her family was wealthy, they weren't as rich as the Vanderbilts or Golds. She married Waldorf Astor in 1906. Waldorf was already wealthy himself, so this wasn't purely a financial transaction, though Nancy's American charm and beauty were definitely part of her appeal. Nancy became the first woman to sit as a Member of Parliament in the British House of Commons, a genuine achievement. She was intelligent, witty, and politically engaged, but she was also, by many accounts, difficult and often unhappy. Her marriage to Waldorf was strained. She threw herself into politics and social causes, perhaps as a way to find purpose in a life that otherwise felt limiting. She spent decades in England, far from her Virginia roots, in a country that never quite accepted her as fully British. Even her political success came with constant reminders that she was an American interloper. These women, the dollar princesses, existed in a strange liminal space, too American for British society to fully accept them, too Europeanized, too titled, for American society to still claim them as truly American. They were caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Many of them expressed this dislocation in letters home. They missed American. They missed the informality, the optimism, the sense of possibility. British aristocratic life, for all its glamour, was also rigid, tradition-bound, and often stifling. The rules were endless and arbitrary. You couldn't do this. You mustn't say that. You had to behave exactly so. And all of it enforced by people who made it clear that you were an outsider who would never truly understand their ways. The loneliness must have been crushing. You are living in a massive estate with dozens of servants, hosting elaborate parties, mingling with the aristocracy, and you are profoundly alone. Your husband doesn't love you. The aristocratic families tolerate you at best. The servants see you as the American who bought the title they serve. You can't talk openly about your unhappiness because that would be improper. You can't confide in your family back in America because letters take weeks to cross the Atlantic. And besides, what could they do? You made your choice. Or rather, they made it for you, and now you have to live with it. So you smile at parties, wear your diamonds and your title, and pretend that everything is fine. And inside, you are dying a little bit every day. Some of these women found solace in causes. They became patrons of the arts, philanthropists, social reformers. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, became deeply involved in charity work, particularly causes related to women and children. This was common among dollar princesses. Denied personal fulfillment in their marriages, they sought meaning through helping others. It is both admirable and heartbreaking. They were trying to create purpose in lives that had been scripted for them, trying to do some good with the positions they'd been forced into. But let's be clear about something. Not all of these marriages were disasters. Some of the dollar princesses ended up in reasonably content marriages. Some even found love, if not at first, then over time. Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn, seemed to have genuine affection for her husband Lord Randolph, though their marriage also had its difficulties. Some women adapted well to British life and came to love their adopted country. The point isn't that every single one of these marriages was a nightmare. The point is that the system itself was fundamentally unjust. Even when it worked out okay, it was still based on treating young women as commodities to be traded, and we need to talk about what happened to the daughters of these dollar princesses, because the cycle often repeated. The half-American daughters of these transatlantic marriages were themselves married off to continue building family alliances. Consuelo's sons both married, and the family's American millions continued to support Blenheim Palace for generations. The Vanderbilt money that Alva had used to buy a title for Consuelo ended up funding the British aristocracy for decades. It is a strange legacy. American industrial wealth, earned through railroads and steel, ending up paying for the maintenance of medieval British estates. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because the scale of this financial transfer is staggering. According to historian Maureen Montgomery's research, between 1870 and 1914, American heiresses brought an estimated $220 million in dowries to their European aristocratic husbands. That is about $6.6 billion in today's currency. Think about that for a second. Nearly $7 billion transferred from American industrialists to European aristocrats over a 40-year period. That is not counting the ongoing support many American families provided, paying for estate restorations, covering gambling debts, providing allowances. The total amount of American money that flowed to Europe through these marriages was almost certainly much higher. What did America get in return? A handful of titles, social cachet for families that craved it, and over 500 young women spending significant portions of their lives in foreign countries, many of them in unhappy marriages. Was it worth it? That depends on who you ask. The mothers who orchestrated these matches would probably say yes. They achieved their goal of securing titles and social status. The fathers who wrote the checks might be more ambivalent. They wanted their wives happy and their daughters settled, and they got both, though not in the way they might have hoped. And the daughters themselves, some would say it was worth it. They found purpose, meaning, even happiness in their roles as titled ladies. But others, like Consuelo in her honest moments, would probably say no. No amount of social status is worth a lifetime of unhappiness. Now let's connect this to the broader context of women's rights in the Gilded Age, because these dollar princess marriages were happening at the exact same time that the women's suffrage movement was gaining strength. The contrast is striking. You have women fighting for the right to vote, to own property, to have legal personhood, and simultaneously you have the wealthiest families in America treating their daughters as property to be sold. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable. The same society that was beginning to recognize that women were autonomous individuals with rights was also perfectly comfortable with arranged marriages that denied women any say in their own futures. Some of the dollar princesses themselves became involved in suffrage and women's rights causes. Alva Vanderbilt, after her divorce, became a prominent suffragist. The irony of her fighting for women's rights after denying her own daughter the right to choose her husband is almost too much to bear, but it also shows how people can change, how someone can perpetuate a system and then later fight against it. Alva eventually recognized that she'd been wrong, though that recognition came too late to undo the damage she'd done to Consuelo. Consuelo herself, after her divorce, also became involved in women's causes. Her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952, was a damning indictment of the system that had shaped her life. She told her story honestly, describing her forced marriage, her unhappiness, her eventual escape. The book was controversial because it violated the social code of discretion. You weren't supposed to talk about these things publicly. You were supposed to maintain the fiction that your marriage was happy, that your title was worth it, that everything was fine. Consuelo refused. She told the truth. And in doing so, she gave voice to all the dollar princesses who had suffered in silence. Let's talk about the physical spaces these women inhabited, because architecture and geography played a role in their isolation. Take Blenheim Palace, where Consuelo lived. It is one of Britain's largest houses, with over 200 rooms spread across several acres. It is magnificent and historically important. It is also cold, drafty, and profoundly isolating. Imagine being a young American woman in your late teens or early 20s, living in a house so vast that you could go days without seeing your husband, even though you are technically living in the same building. The servants are everywhere, but they're not your friends or confidants. They're employees who see you as the American who bought their employer's title. You are surrounded by people and utterly alone. The estates themselves were often located in remote areas. Blenheim is in Oxfordshire, a beautiful but isolated location. You are miles from London, miles from any major city. Your social life is limited to the neighbouring aristocratic families, many of whom view you with suspicion. You can't just pop into town for shopping or to see friends. Everything requires planning, carriages, arrangements. You are trapped in a gilded cage, and the cage happens to be a palace. But it is still a cage. Many of these women wrote about the weather of all things. British weather was cold, damp, and grey compared to what many of them were used to in America. It seems like a small thing, but it is part of the cumulative weight of displacement. Everything is unfamiliar. The weather, the food, the social customs, the very rhythm of life. You are constantly adjusting, constantly reminded that you are a foreigner, and you can never fully belong because you weren't born into this world. You bought your way in, and everyone knows it. Let's talk about the social season in London, because that was both a highlight and a torment for many dollar princesses. The London season was a series of social events, balls, dinners, presentations at court, opera performances, races, all designed to bring the aristocracy together. For a titled lady, participating in the season was mandatory. You had to be seen, had to maintain your social position. This meant months in London, away from your country estate, in a whirlwind of social obligations. You had to have the right dresses, the right jewels, the right carriages. You had to know everyone, remember everyone's titles and precedents. You had to make conversation without saying anything controversial. It was exhausting, and underneath all the glamour was vicious social competition. Women were judged ruthlessly on their appearance, their dress, their demeanor. Any misstep was noted and discussed. The American dollar princesses were under particular scrutiny. They had to prove they deserved their titles, had to show they could perform aristocracy, as well as those born to it. The pressure must have been immense. You are wearing a fortune in jewels, paid for with your father's money. You are carrying a title, bought with your dowry. And everyone in the room knows it, and they're watching to see if you'll make a mistake. Give them ammunition to whisper that Americans don't really belong in aristocratic society. Some women thrived in this environment. They had the personality, the skills, the resilience to succeed in this brutal social arena. Others wilted under the pressure. They became anxious, depressed, physically ill from the stress. Remember, many of these women were quite young, late teens or early 20s. They were still figuring out who they were, and they were doing it under the scrutiny of an entire social class that was predisposed to find them wanting. Let's talk about the children of these marriages because they're an often overlooked part of this story. The whole point of these marriages from the aristocratic side was to produce heirs, sons to inherit the title and the estate, daughters to be married off to continue building family alliances. These children were half American, half British. They were raised primarily in Britain, in the aristocratic tradition, but they had American mothers and often spent time in America visiting their maternal grandparents. They existed in the same liminal space as their mothers between two worlds. For the mothers, these children were often their primary source of meaning and affection. If your husband is cold and indifferent, if your social position is precarious, if you are lonely and displaced, your children become everything. Many of these women threw themselves into motherhood with an intensity born of having few other outlets for their love and energy. They were devoted mothers by all accounts, but there is also something heartbreaking about it. These women had been denied the chance to choose their own lives, and now they were raising children who would be slotted into the same rigid social structure, sons who would inherit titles and estates, daughters who would be married off to suitable matches. Consuelo's sons, John and Ivor, were raised as British aristocrats. They went to Eton and Oxford, the traditional path for aristocratic boys. They grew up knowing that John, as the eldest, would inherit the dukedom and Blenheim. That was his destiny determined at birth. Ivor, as the second son, would have to find his own way, but still within the constraints of his class. Consuelo loved her sons deeply, but she also must have recognised that they were products of a system she'd come to resent. They were the heirs that had been the whole point of her forced marriage. Now let's talk about the few women who resisted, who fought back against the system. Because while most dollar princesses eventually capitulated to family pressure and societal expectations, there were a few who refused. Their stories are less well known because they didn't result in glittering weddings and ducal titles, but they're worth telling. These were women who said no and made it stick. Women who chose love over status, happiness over duty, self-determination over social approval. One such woman was Clara Huntington, daughter of Collis P. Huntington, one of the big four railroad tycoons who built the Central Pacific Railroad. Clara was expected to marry into high society, possibly even European aristocracy. Instead, she fell in love with and married Prince Hatzfeldt, a German aristocrat who was considerably older than her and whose title wasn't particularly prestigious by the standards of her family's ambitions. Her father disapproved. There were arguments, threats, pressure. Clara married him anyway. The marriage turned out to be reasonably happy, but Clara was partially estranged from her family for years because she'd chosen her own path. Or consider Catherine Dewar, daughter of a wealthy New York family who refused several aristocratic suitors to marry a man she actually loved. The man happened to be wealthy and socially acceptable, so the scandal was minimal. But Catherine's insistence on marrying for love rather than accepting the most prestigious offer was unusual for her class and time. She was lucky that her preferred choice was acceptable to her family. Many women didn't have that luck. These acts of resistance were rare because the costs were so high. If you refused to marry as your family wished, you risked being cut off financially. If you married against your family's wishes, you faced social ostracism. And if you rejected society's expectations entirely, you had very few options. In the Gilded Age, respectable careers for upper-class women barely existed. You couldn't just become financially independent and live your own life. Your options were marriage, living as a dependent in your family's home, or the precarious and scandalous life of an independent woman, which usually meant social exile. Most women weren't willing or able to pay that price. But let's talk about the women who did pay it, who chose independence over comfort. There were a handful of American heiresses who rejected marriage altogether. Some became artists, writers, or philanthropists, using their inherited wealth to fund their own pursuits. Some became expatriates, living in Paris or London on their own terms outside the constraints of family expectations. They were often labelled eccentric or scandalous. Society whispered about them, but they were free in a way that the dollar princesses weren't. One example is Natalie Clifford Barney, heiress to a Washington, D.C. fortune who moved to Paris and lived openly as a lesbian, hosting a literary salon and conducting love affairs with other women. She was everything Gilded Age society said a woman shouldn't be: independent, sexual, unapologetic. She used her wealth to create a life on her own terms, and she didn't care what society thought. For her, the price of freedom was worth it, but most women couldn't make that choice. The social and financial consequences were too severe. Let's return to the mainstream dollar princesses and talk about what happened as they aged, because the Gilded Age didn't last forever, and neither did the system that created dollar princess marriages. The First World War changed everything. Suddenly, European aristocracy didn't seem so glamorous. British and French nobility were dying in trenches. Estates were being sold off to pay death duties. The social order that had seemed eternal was collapsing, and the dollar princesses were left stranded, often widowed, watching the world they'd been sold in to disappear. Many of them returned to America, at least part-time. They'd spent decades as European aristocrats, and now they were trying to reintegrate into American society. Some found it surprisingly difficult. They'd become Europeanized, adopted British or French manners and accents. American society, especially post-war American society, found them affected and out of touch. They were too American for Europe and too European for America, caught permanently between worlds. Consuelo returned to America after her divorce and marriage to Jacques Balsan. She lived in New York and on Balsan's estate in France, splitting her time between the two countries. By all accounts, her second marriage was happy. She'd finally gotten to choose her own husband, and she chose well, but she'd lost decades to a marriage she'd never wanted. By the time she found happiness, she was in her 40s. Her youth was gone, spent in service to a system that had never cared about her well-being. Other dollar princesses spent their final years in faded European estates, their American fortunes depleted by decades of supporting aristocratic lifestyles. Some outlived their husbands and remained in Europe, too old and too disconnected from America to go back. They'd become European by residence, if not by birth, and they stayed in the countries that had been their cages, perhaps because after so many years, they didn't know where else to go. The whole system of dollar princess marriages essentially ended with World War I. The economic and social conditions that had made these marriages attractive to both sides evaporated. American families no longer craved European titles, quite so desperately. American society had developed its own sense of identity and status, less dependent on European validation. And European aristocrats, many of them impoverished by war taxes and estate duties, no longer had the estates and social standing to offer. Some transatlantic marriages still happened, but they were based more on genuine affection than on the calculated transactions of the Gilded Age. By the 1920s, the world had changed fundamentally. Women had won the right to vote in America and Britain. Social mores were loosening. The rigid class structures of the Victorian and Edwardian eras were crumbling. Young women had more freedom, more ability to shape their own lives. The idea of forcing your daughter into a loveless marriage to secure a title seemed increasingly barbaric. The dollar princesses, those who were still alive, must have looked at the younger generation with a mixture of envy and relief. Envy that these young women had freedoms they'd never had. Relief that their daughters and granddaughters wouldn't have to endure what they'd endured. Now let's talk about the legacy of these marriages, because they left their mark on both American and British society. The infusion of American money into British aristocracy quite literally saved some historic estates. Blenheim Palace, for instance, might have crumbled without Vanderbilt money. Other estates were similarly preserved or restored with American fortunes. In that sense, American heiresses helped maintain a piece of European cultural heritage. But the cost was their own happiness and freedom. Genetically and socially, these marriages created lasting links between American wealth and European aristocracy. Winston Churchill, one of the most important figures of the 20th century, was the son of a dollar princess, Jenny Jerome. His mother's American connections and American money played a role in his early political career. He was a product of these transatlantic marriages, embodying both American energy and British tradition. Many other influential figures had similar backgrounds, half American, half aristocratic, shaped by the collision of two worlds. Culturally, the dollar princess phenomenon left us with stories, both the real ones and the fictionalized versions. Novels and films have explored these marriages, often romanticizing them but sometimes capturing their darker realities. Edith Wharton, herself part of the Gilded Age society, wrote about these social dynamics in novels like The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence. Her work captures the suffocating social expectations that drove families to sacrifice their daughters' happiness for status. In more recent years, there has been renewed interest in these stories. Television shows like Downton Abbey and The Gilded Age have brought this era back into popular consciousness. These shows often feature American heiresses marrying into British families, though the portrayals are usually more romantic than the reality was. The real stories were often darker, more complicated, more painful than any television drama would dare to be. So what do we make of all this? What does it mean that America's wealthiest families, the people who had everything money could buy, were so desperate for social status that they'd sell their daughters to get it? What does it say about Gilded Age values? That young women were treated as commodities, that their happiness was considered less important than a title? And what does it tell us about the endurance of these women that so many of them survived, adapted, found meaning and purpose even in situations they hadn't chosen? The dollar princesses were victims of a system that valued status over humanity, but they were also, many of them, remarkable women who made the best of impossible situations. They managed vast estates, raised children, engaged in philanthropy, navigated complex social and political landscapes, all while dealing with the personal pain of loveless marriages and cultural displacement. They deserve to be remembered not just as rich American girls who bought titles, but as complex individuals who lived through extraordinary circumstances. Their stories are a window into a particular moment in history, when America was figuring out its identity, when new money clashed with old traditions, when women were property in ways both legal and social. These women were caught in the cross-currents of massive social change, and many of them paid a terrible price. But their experiences also illuminate how systems of power work, how status is created and maintained, how families perpetuate cycles of control across generations, and how women navigate patriarchal structures with the limited agency available to them. Think about Consuelo, forced into marriage at 18, spending decades in unhappiness, finally finding freedom in her 40s. Think about all the years she lost, all the possibilities that were closed to her because her mother valued a title more than her daughter's happiness. But also think about her resilience. She survived. She eventually escaped. She told her story. She lived to be 87, long enough to see the world that had constrained her change beyond recognition. There is tragedy in her story, but there is also strength. Think about all the nameless dollar princesses whose stories we don't know, who suffered in silence, who never got to tell their own stories. Women who died young in childbirth, who endured decades of abuse, who were ground down by the weight of social expectations and loveless marriages. We owe it to them to remember that behind every glittering title and magnificent estate was a human being who had dreams, desires, and the fundamental right to shape her own life. A right that was denied to her. And think about the mothers who orchestrated these marriages, women like Alva Vanderbilt. It is easy to vilify them, and in many ways they deserve it. They prioritized status over their daughter's well-being. They perpetuated a cruel system, but they were also products of their time, shaped by values that told them a woman's worth was measured by her marriage, that a mother's job was to secure the best match regardless of emotional cost. They were victims who became victimizers, trapped in cycles they didn't create but helped perpetuate. The whole dollar princess phenomenon reveals uncomfortable truths about how power, wealth, and gender intersected in the Gilded Age. It shows us that having money doesn't necessarily mean having freedom, especially if you are a woman. It demonstrates how families use their children, and especially their daughters, as pawns in social and economic strategies. And it illustrates how resilient people can be, how even in terrible situations, individuals find ways to survive, to create meaning, to leave their mark. As we come to the end of tonight's journey, I want you to think about what these stories mean for us today. We like to think we've moved past the Gilded Age, that we no longer treat women as property, that marriages are based on love rather than financial transactions, and certainly legal and social progress has been made. Women have rights our dollar princesses couldn't imagine, but look closer. How many marriages today are still influenced by family pressure, social expectations, economic calculations? How many people, and let's be honest, especially women, are still expected to prioritize family wishes over personal happiness? How many young people face pressure to marry the right person from the right background, to maintain family status or business connections? The forms have changed, but some of the dynamics remain. We're still navigating the tension between individual autonomy and family expectations. We're still figuring out how to value both love and practical considerations in marriage. We're still dealing with systems that give some people more power than others to shape their own lives. The dollar princesses lived over a century ago, but their struggles aren't as distant as we might like to think. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Consuelo standing at the altar, 18 years old, marrying a man she didn't love, giving up the man she did love, all because her mother demanded it. Remember all the young women in gorgeous dresses and glittering jewels, smiling for photographs while dying inside. Remember that freedom and happiness aren't guaranteed by wealth, that sometimes the most beautiful cages are still cages. And remember that these women, despite everything, survived. They endured. They found ways to live, to create meaning, to exercise what little agency they had. Their stories are cautionary tales about the cost of prioritizing status over humanity. But they're also stories of resilience, of women navigating impossible situations with whatever strength and grace they could muster. They deserve to be remembered not just as dollar princesses or as duchesses and countesses, but as individuals who lived complex lives in difficult times, who were denied choices they should have had, and who nonetheless left their mark on history. But before we close this chapter, let's explore more of the specific women whose lives illuminate different facets of this phenomenon. Because while Consuelo Vanderbilt's story is the most famous, she was far from alone, and each woman's experience offers unique insights into the system that ensnared them. Let's talk about Anna Gould, daughter of the infamous robber baron Jay Gould. Anna's story is particularly dramatic because it involved not one but two disastrous marriages to French aristocrats. and it illustrates how even divorce didn't necessarily free these women from the cycle of transactional marriages. Anna was born in 1875 into one of America's wealthiest families. Her father, J. Gould, was worth an estimated $77 million when he died in 1892, which would be roughly $2.3 billion today. Anna inherited a substantial portion of that fortune. In 1895, when Anna was just 20, she married Count Boniface de Castellan, a French aristocrat who was everything a Gilded Age family could want on paper, titled charming, handsome, and completely broke. The Count needed money desperately, and Anna had it. The marriage settlement was staggering. Anna brought a dowry estimated at $15 million in today's money, with the promise of more to come. The Count immediately began spending it with a recklessness that shocked even Gilded Age sensibilities. Imagine you are Anna, watching your husband burn through your inheritance at a pace that would make modern lottery winners blush. The Count built a massive mansion in Paris, the Palais Rose, which cost over $2 million in 1890s currency, roughly $60 million today. He threw parties that cost tens of thousands of dollars each. He bought art, furniture, jewels, all with Anna's money. He had no concept of budgeting or restraint. Why would he? It wasn't his money he was spending. It was his wife's, and in his view, that made it his to do with as he pleased. The Count was also flagrantly unfaithful, conducting affairs openly and with no regard for Anna's feelings or reputation. This was somewhat tolerated in French aristocratic society, where marriages were often understood to be separate from romantic attachments. But the humiliation for Anna was still profound. She was funding her husband's lifestyle, including, effectively, his mistresses. She bore him 3 sons, fulfilling her duty to provide heirs, and she watched helplessly as her fortune disappeared into his bottomless appetite for luxury. Finally, in 1906, after 11 years of marriage, Anna divorced the Count. This was scandalous. Divorce among titled Europeans was rare and carried significant social stigma, but Anna had reached her limit. The Count had spent an estimated $10 million of her money, about $300 million in today's currency. The divorce settlement allowed Anna to keep her remaining fortune, but it couldn't return the years and money she'd lost. You might think Anna would have learned her lesson about marrying European aristocrats, but just 2 years later, in 1908, she married again, this time to the Count's cousin, Prince Haile de Talleyrand-Périgord. The new husband had a better title and supposedly better character, but the basic dynamic remained the same, American money supporting a European title. Anna spent the rest of her life in France, far from her American roots, having traded her inheritance for titles that brought her more grief than glory. She died in 1961, having lived through both world wars, the collapse of the aristocratic world she'd married into, and profound changes in women's rights that came too late for her. Anna's story illustrates several important points. First, even divorce didn't free these women from the system. Anna escaped one bad aristocratic marriage only to enter another. Second, the amounts of money involved were staggering, even by the standards of extreme wealth. The Count de Castellane spent $300 million in today's money during their 11-year marriage. That is not supporting a lifestyle. That is liquidating a fortune. Third, these marriages could span decades. Anna was 20 when she first married and 86 when she died. She spent the vast majority of her life as a titled European, living with the choices made when she was barely an adult. Now let's talk about Jenny Jerome, who became Lady Randolph Churchill and the mother of Winston Churchill. Jenny's story is often cited as a more successful dollar princess marriage, and in some ways it was. But even her experience reveals the constraints and compromises these women faced. Jenny was born in Brooklyn in 1854, daughter of a wealthy financier. She was beautiful, vivacious, and charismatic. When she met Lord Randolph Churchill at a ball in 1873, it was reportedly love at first sight for both of them. They married in 1874, when Jenny was 19 and Randolph was 24. Unlike many dollar princess marriages, this one seemed to start with genuine affection on both sides. Jenny brought a dowry of £50,000, about $6.5 million in today's money. substantial, but not as massive as some of her peers. Lord Randolph was a younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, which meant he had the family connection, but wouldn't inherit the title or the estate. For a while, the marriage seemed happy. Jenny threw herself into British political and social life. She was intelligent and ambitious, and she used her charm and social skills to advance her husband's political career. Lord Randolph became a prominent politician, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Jenny hosted salons, cultivated influential contacts, and was widely regarded as one of the most fascinating women in London society. She seemed to be a dollar princess success story, but look closer and you see the same patterns. Jenny's money supported the Churchill lifestyle. Her American connections helped Randolph's career when Randolph's political career collapsed after a disastrous resignation in 1886. Jenny was left managing the family finances and trying to maintain their social position. Randolph developed what was likely syphilis and descended into mental and physical deterioration. He died in 1895 at age 45, leaving Jenny a widow at 40. Even with genuine affection between the couple, even with Jenny's considerable talents and intelligence, the basic structure remained: American money and energy propping up British aristocratic status. And after Randolph's death, Jenny faced the same challenges other dollar princess widows. She remarried twice more, both times to men considerably younger than herself, both marriages ultimately unhappy. She spent decades navigating British society as an American outsider, brilliant and charming, but never fully accepted. Jenny's legacy is complicated. She was undeniably successful in many ways. She raised Winston Churchill, one of the most important figures of the 20th century, and by all accounts was a devoted mother who supported his early career. She was a published author, a socialite, and a political influencer at a time when women had no formal political power. But she also spent her life performing an identity that wasn't originally hers, supporting systems that constrained her, and using her talents in service of others' ambitions rather than her own. What might Jenny Jerome have achieved if she'd stayed in America, if she'd been able to pursue her own ambitions directly rather than channeling them through her husband and son? Let's talk about another case, that of Mary Victoria Leiter, who became Lady Curzon and eventually Vicereine of India. Mary was the daughter of Levi Leiter, co-founder of the Chicago department store that would become Marshall Field's. She married George Curzon in 1895 when she was 27, which made her comparatively old for a Gilded Age bride. Curzon was a British aristocrat and politician who would eventually become Viceroy of India. Mary brought a dowry estimated at $1.5 million, about $50 million in today's money. The marriage was, by most accounts, genuinely affectionate. Curzon was demanding and often difficult, but he seemed to genuinely love Mary. She certainly loved him and threw herself into supporting his career with remarkable dedication. When Curzon became Viceroy of India in 1898, Mary became Vicereine, essentially the First Lady of British India. This was an extraordinary position, and Mary filled it with grace and dedication. But the cost was enormous. Life in India was hard on Mary's health. The climate, the stress, the constant social obligations all took their toll. She had 3 daughters in rapid succession and struggled with complications from the births. According to letters and diaries from the period, Mary was often exhausted, frequently ill, and profoundly homesick. She missed her family in America desperately. She was performing an incredibly demanding role, representing the British Empire in India, and she was doing it while fighting health problems and isolation. Mary died in 1906 at age 36, likely from complications related to her pregnancies and overall declining health. She'd been married for 11 years and had spent much of that time in India, thousands of miles from her home and family, in service to her husband's career in the British Empire. Her American fortune had supported Curzon's political rise, and she'd paid for it with her health and ultimately her life. After her death, Curzon remarried, again to a wealthy woman. The pattern continued. Mary Leiter's story shows that even marriages that started with love could be deadly for the dollar princesses. The expectations placed on these women were crushing. They were supposed to support their husbands' careers, manage vast households, fulfill endless social obligations, bear children, maintain their appearance and charm, and do it all while being perpetually graceful and cheerful. The stress was immense, and many of them, like Mary, paid with their health. Now let's talk about what life was actually like day to day for these women in their aristocratic households, because the reality was far removed from the fairy tale image. Take a typical day for a duchess living in a British country estate in the 1890s or early 1900s. You wake up in a massive bedroom that is freezing, because even with a fireplace, these old houses are impossible to heat adequately. A lady's maid helps you dress, a process that takes well over an hour, because the clothing of the era is incredibly complex. Corsets, layers of undergarments, elaborate dresses with dozens of buttons or hooks. Breakfast is formal, even if it is just you and your husband might not even show up or might eat in silence behind a newspaper. After breakfast, you have household duties. You meet with the housekeeper, plan menus, deal with any household issues. This sounds simple, but remember, you are managing a house with dozens or even hundreds of rooms and a staff of 20, 30, 50 people or more. It is like running a small hotel, except you are expected to do it with perfect grace, while never appearing to actually work. Mid-morning, you might receive callers or make calls yourself, a complex social ritual with strict rules about timing, duration and etiquette. You can't call on someone at the wrong time or stay too long or leave too soon without causing offence. In the afternoon, you might have charity work, committee meetings for various causes. This is one of the few areas where you can exercise any real autonomy, and many dollar princesses threw themselves into philanthropy, partly because it was one of the few socially acceptable ways to have any impact or purpose. Late afternoon is for changing into a different, elaborate outfit, because you can't possibly wear the same dress from morning into evening. Dinner is formal, often with guests, which means performing for hours, making conversation, being charming and gracious, managing the flow of the meal, all while wearing a corset so tight you can barely breathe and sitting up absolutely straight, because slouching is unthinkable. After dinner, there might be entertainment, music, cards, conversation, or if there is no company, your husband might disappear to his study or his club, and you are left in your sitting room with your needlework or a book, alone in a house full of people. You go to bed late, exhausted from performing all day, and tomorrow you'll do it all again, every day. For years, this is your life, and that is during the routine parts of the year. During the London season, the pace is even more intense. You are attending multiple events every day: balls, dinners, the opera, races, garden parties, presentations at court. You need different outfits for all of it, dozens of elaborate gowns that cost fortunes. You are seeing and being seen, constantly on display, constantly being judged. It is exhausting in a way that is hard to comprehend from our modern perspective. Now layer onto this the homesickness that many of these women felt. You are thousands of miles from your family. Letters take weeks to cross the Atlantic. You can't just call home when you are feeling low. You are surrounded by people who speak with different accents, have different customs, eat different food. Everything is foreign. And you can never fully belong because you weren't born into this world. You are always going to be the American, the outsider, the one who bought her way in. Some women coped by creating little pockets of America in their British lives. They'd insist on certain American foods, maintain American friendships through correspondence, visit America when they could. But these were just small comforts in lives that were fundamentally displaced. You can't go home because your home is now in Britain, but Britain never quite feels like home because you weren't born to it. Let's talk about the specific issue of childbirth in this era, because it is a crucial part of understanding what these women endured. Producing an heir was the primary duty of an aristocratic wife. That is why you were married, to continue the family line. The pressure to have children, specifically sons, was immense. If you didn't produce an heir, your marriage was considered a failure, and you might face ridicule, isolation, or even divorce. Pregnancy and childbirth in the late 1800s and early 1900s were dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were significant. Infections, hemorrhages, complications during delivery, all of these could and did kill women routinely. According to historical health data compiled by the CDC, maternal mortality in 1900 was about 850 deaths per 100,000 live births. That is nearly 1%. 1 in every 100 women who gave birth died from it. And this is an average for women who had multiple pregnancies. The cumulative risk was higher. Think about being a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, newly married, and knowing that you are expected to get pregnant as soon as possible, and that every pregnancy carries a real risk of death. The pressure must have been nightmarish. You are supposed to produce an heir, but doing so might kill you. And if you do survive, you are expected to do it again to produce a spare, a second son in case something happens to the first. The actual experience of childbirth was traumatic. Anesthesia for childbirth was controversial and not always used. Queen Victoria had famously used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, which helped legitimize pain relief. But many doctors still believed that childbirth pain was natural and necessary, so you might be giving birth with minimal or no pain relief, attended by doctors who had questionable understanding of hygiene and infection control. Medical knowledge was advancing, but slowly, and plenty of doctors were still using practices that we now know were dangerous. After birth, you were expected to recover quickly and resume your social duties. There was no extended maternity leave, no acknowledgement that you'd just been through major physical trauma. Within weeks, you were supposed to be back to hosting dinners and attending balls, corseted and elaborately dressed, smiling and graceful, as if nothing had happened. Many women developed lasting health problems from pregnancies and births, problems that were downplayed or ignored because complaining about your health was considered weak and unfeminine. And then there is the question of what happened if you couldn't have children. Some dollar princesses faced this situation, and it was devastating. Your entire purpose in the marriage was to produce heirs. If you couldn't do that, you'd failed in the most fundamental way. Your husband might seek an annulment or divorce. Even if he didn't, you might face constant reminders of your failure, potential replacement by a second wife if your husband could arrange it, or just a lifetime of being considered a disappointment. Let's talk about one particularly heartbreaking case. Clara Ward, daughter of a wealthy Detroit family, who eloped in 1890 with the Belgian Prince de Caraman. Chimay. Clara was beautiful and impulsive, and the marriage was initially passionate, but it deteriorated quickly. The prince was abusive and unfaithful. Clara, isolated in Belgium, far from her family, trapped in a miserable marriage, eventually did something almost unthinkable for a woman of her class and time. She left him. In 1896, Clara ran away with a Hungarian violinist named Janczy Rig. The scandal was enormous. An aristocratic woman abandoning her husband and children for a gypsy musician. Society was horrified and titillated in equal measure. Clara was vilified, called a disgrace, a loose woman, a terrible mother. The prince divorced her and kept custody of their children. Clara's family was humiliated. She became a social pariah. Clara married Janczy Rig, but that marriage also failed. She married several more times, each marriage to less respectable men, each one ending badly. She went from being a princess to being a scandal-ridden debauchee that no respectable society would acknowledge. She died in 1916 in relative poverty, a cautionary tale about what happened to women who refused to stay in their gilded cages. The message was clear: even if your marriage is abusive and miserable, leaving is worse. The cage might be painful, but at least it is a cage. Outside is social death. Clara Ward's story is extreme, but it illustrates the limited options these women had. You could stay in an unhappy marriage and maintain your social position, or you could leave and lose everything: your children, your status, your reputation, your financial security. Most women faced with that choice stayed. Clara's story is remarkable precisely because she chose differently, and the price she paid was devastating. Now let's talk about the cultural production around these marriages, because the phenomenon generated a lot of commentary at the time. American newspapers covered these weddings extensively, with detailed descriptions of the dresses, the jewels, the ceremonies, the dowries. On one hand, there was pride. American wealth was conquering European aristocracy. Look at our girls becoming duchesses. On the other hand, there was criticism. Was it right to sell our daughters to decadent European aristocrats? Were these marriages un-American betrayals of democratic values? Editorials debated the issue. Some argued that these marriages showed American superiority. Our money was rescuing bankrupt European nobility. Others argued they showed American inferiority. We were so insecure about our own society that we had to buy European validation. Both sides agreed that something significant was happening. American identity was being negotiated through these marriages. European commentary was equally divided. Some aristocrats welcomed the American money that was saving their estates. Others resented the American invasion, complaining that their ancient families were being corrupted by commerce, that vulgar American girls were buying their way into positions they didn't deserve. There was a lot of anti-American snobbery, thinly veiled in concerns about maintaining standards and traditions. Novels and plays of the era often featured dollar princesses as characters. Some portrayed them sympathetically as victims of parental ambition. Others depicted them as calculating social climbers willing to do anything for a title. The real women, as always, were more complicated than either stereotype. They were individuals with their own motivations, dreams, fears, and compromises. Let's talk about the economic impact of these marriages on the British aristocracy, because it was substantial. According to research by historian Maureen Montgomery, American money propped up dozens of aristocratic estates that would have otherwise collapsed. The influx of American capital in the late 1800s and early 1900s quite literally saved parts of the British aristocracy from bankruptcy. Estates were restored, debts were paid, investments were made, all with American dowries. This created a bizarre situation where British aristocratic culture, which prided itself on ancient lineage and tradition, was actually being funded by American industrial money. The very thing the aristocracy claimed made them superior, their old families and estates, was being maintained by the new money they claimed to despise. The irony was lost on almost no one, but the money didn't last forever. Many aristocratic husbands burned through their wives' fortunes at astonishing rates. The Count de Castellan spending $10 million in 11 years was extreme but not unique. Even more modest spenders could deplete substantial fortunes over decades. By the 1920s and 30s, many of the estates that had been saved by American money in the 1890s and 1900s were again facing financial crisis. The American money was gone, spent on maintaining lifestyles and estates that were fundamentally unsustainable in the modern world. This brings us to the question of what these marriages meant for changing social structures. Because while they seem to reinforce aristocracy by providing financial support, they also undermined it. The British aristocracy was based on the idea that blood and breeding mattered more than money. But if dukes were marrying for money, if ancient titles were being sold to the highest bidder, what did that say about the value of blood and breeding? The very act of accepting these marriages acknowledged that money could buy status, which contradicted the foundational mythology of aristocracy. Some British aristocrats recognised this and resisted. There were families that refused to allow their sons to marry American heiresses, viewing it as degrading to accept money in exchange for titles. But economic pressure was powerful. Estates needed capital, and American heiresses had it. Principals didn't pay for roof repairs or servant wages. Gradually, resistance crumbled, and what had once been scandalous became normal. The normalization of these marriages actually accelerated the decline of aristocracy. Once you accept that titles can be bought, you've admitted that they're just another commodity. The mystique is gone. This is part of why aristocracy as a social and political force declined so dramatically in the 20th century. The First World War certainly played a role, but the commercialization of titles that dollar princess marriages represented was also significant. You can't maintain that you are inherently superior when everyone knows your great-grandfather sold his title to an American railroad heiress. Let's talk about the children of these marriages again, because their experiences illuminate the long-term consequences of these unions. These children were raised in a peculiar cultural space. They had American mothers who often tried to instill some American values, or at least maintain connections to American family, but they were being raised as British or French or European aristocrats, educated in that tradition, expected to fulfill those roles. The result was often a kind of cultural hybridity that didn't quite fit anywhere. Winston Churchill is the most famous example. His mother was American, and he maintained connections to America throughout his life. He understood America in ways that purely British politicians didn't. This proved crucial during World War II when building the Anglo-American alliance. His American heritage, the product of a dollar princess marriage, helped him navigate relationships with American leaders. In this case, the cultural mixing produced someone uniquely equipped for a particular historical moment, but not all cases worked out so well. Some children of these marriages struggled with identity issues. Were they American or European? Should they identify with their mother's family or their father's? When nationalism became fierce during World War I, these questions became even more fraught. Half American children of British aristocrats found themselves torn between two countries that were allies but also distinct, sometimes competing powers. And of course, many of these children, especially daughters, faced the same marriage pressures their mothers had. The system perpetuated itself. Daughters of dollar princesses were themselves married off to consolidate family alliances, to merge fortunes to maintain status. Some rebelled, some accepted it, but the pattern continued. Now let's talk about the dollar princesses who went to countries other than Britain, because while British aristocracy got the most American heiresses, they weren't the only destination. France received a significant number of American brides for French counts and marquises. Italy attracted others to marry into Italian nobility. Germany, Austria, Russia all had some American women marrying into their aristocracies. Each country's aristocracy had its own character and constraints. French aristocracy was perhaps less formal than British, but French society could be even more insular and difficult for outsiders to penetrate. Italian aristocracy came with the complexity of Italian politics and the Catholic Church's influence. German aristocracy was rigidly hierarchical and formal. Russian aristocracy was lavish but also politically dangerous, especially as revolution approached. The American heiresses who married into these various aristocracies faced challenges specific to their adopted countries. Language barriers could be significant. If you married a French count, you needed to speak French fluently, not just the polite conversational French you'd learned from a governess, but truly fluently. Social customs varied. What was acceptable in British society might be scandalous in Italian society, or vice versa. These women had to navigate multiple layers of culture and expectation, often with limited preparation. Some found the experience utterly alienating. Anna Gould, stuck in France with her spending-addicted count, reportedly felt isolated and miserable for years. Others adapted more successfully, or at least appeared to. But all of them were navigating foreign waters, trying to maintain their footing in cultures that saw them as outsiders. Let's talk about the role of money management in these marriages, because it reveals a lot about power dynamics. In most cases, the marriage settlement transferred control of the wife's fortune to the husband. Yes, there were usually legal protections, trusts, and settlements that prevented the husband from completely squandering the principal, but the husband controlled the income from the fortune and made all major financial decisions. The wife received an allowance. Think about that for a moment. You bring millions of dollars to the marriage, but you don't control it. Your husband gives you an allowance, money to spend on clothes, personal items, charity, whatever he deems appropriate. If you want more, you have to ask. If you want to help your family financially, you need his permission. If you want to invest or save or do anything significant with money that was yours, you need approval from the man who married you specifically. To get that money, some husbands were generous with allowances, others were not. There are documented cases of incredibly wealthy women whose dowries were in the millions, being given pitifully small allowances by their husbands. The Count de Castellan, while spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on parties and mistresses, reportedly gave Anna Gould a relatively modest allowance for her personal expenses. The cruelty of this is hard to overstate. It is your money, but you can't touch it. This financial control gave husbands immense power. If your husband controlled your money, he controlled you. You couldn't leave because you had no access to funds. You couldn't refuse his demands because you were financially dependent on him, even though the money was originally yours. The legal structures of the era created a situation where American heiresses, some of the wealthiest women in the world on paper, had less financial autonomy than middle-class, working women who at least controlled their own wages. Some women tried to fight this through the legal systems. There were cases of American heiresses suing their husbands for control of their own money. These cases were scandalous and often unsuccessful. Courts were run by men, laws were written by men, and the whole system presumed male financial authority. Even when women won some protections, enforcement was difficult. How do you force an aristocrat in his own country to comply with financial arrangements he finds inconvenient? The money issues often became flashpoints in these marriages. Arguments about spending, about support for the wife's family, about financial decisions. These were common, and they revealed the fundamental imbalance of power. The husband had legal control. The wife had only whatever influence she could exert through persuasion or social pressure, and if the husband didn't care about maintaining a harmonious marriage, even that leverage was limited. Let's talk about the specific experience of being presented at court, because this was a crucial ritual for aristocratic women, and especially important for American-born women trying to establish their place in European society. Being presented at the British court, for instance, meant being formally introduced to the Queen, and it was required before you could fully participate in aristocratic social life. The presentation ceremony was elaborate and stressful. You had to wear specific formal dress, an elaborate gown with a train of specific length, feathers in your hair, a veil, specific jewellery. You had to learn the exact protocol for entering the presence chamber, how to walk, how to curtsy, which was a deep, complex curtsy that required practice, how to back out of the room without tripping on your train or turning your back on the Queen. One wrong move and you could humiliate yourself and your family. For American women, this ceremony was especially fraught. You were already seen as an outsider. Any mistake would be noted and gossiped about as proof that Americans didn't really belong in aristocratic society. The pressure to perform perfectly was immense, and this was just one of dozens of social rituals you had to master, each with its own complex rules and potential for embarrassment. Women spent weeks preparing for their court presentations. They had dress fittings, practiced their curtsies, memorized protocol, and then the day itself being dressed by multiple servants, being transported to the palace, waiting in rooms full of other nervous women, finally being called, walking into the presence chamber with hundreds of eyes watching you, executing the perfect curtsy, backing out without falling, and then it was over, and you'd either done it right or you hadn't, and either way, society had judged you. After successful presentation, you were officially part of the aristocratic social world. You could attend court events, be invited to the most exclusive balls and dinners, but you'd also just been through a ritual designed to test and humble you, to make absolutely clear that you were entering a world with strict rules and high expectations. For women who'd grown up in relatively informal American society, even wealthy American society. The rigidity of European aristocratic protocol could be suffocating. Now let's talk about the health consequences of this lifestyle for these women, because they were significant. The physical demands were intense. Corseting alone caused serious health problems. Women wore corsets laced so tightly that their organs were compressed. Their breathing was restricted, and their spines were impacted. Fainting was common. Digestive problems were endemic. Long-term corseting could cause permanent damage to ribs and internal organs. The elaborate dress was heavy and restrictive. Gowns with layers of fabric, heavy embellishments, long trains. Wearing this for hours during social events was physically exhausting. Add in the mental and emotional stress of constant social performance, the isolation many felt, the unhappiness in their marriages, and you have a recipe for serious health problems. Many dollar princesses developed what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses. Depression and anxiety were common, though not labeled or treated as such. Physical manifestations of stress, headaches, digestive issues, fatigue, were frequent. Some women became semi-invalids, spending much of their time in bed or confined to their rooms, officially due to vague health complaints, but really because they couldn't cope with the demands of their lives. Mary Leiter dying at 36 was extreme but not unique. Other dollar princesses died young from complications of childbirth, from illnesses likely exacerbated by stress, from what we'd now call preventable conditions. The lifestyle they led was in many ways incompatible with good health. They were under constant stress, often isolated, frequently unhappy, and expected to maintain appearances no matter how they felt. The toll on their bodies and minds was real and sometimes fatal, and there was very little acknowledgement of or support for mental health. If you were depressed or anxious, that was a personal failing, a weakness of character. You were expected to overcome it through willpower and prayer. The idea that your circumstances might be making you ill, that being trapped in a loveless marriage thousands of miles from home might cause psychological distress, that wasn't really acknowledged. You were just being difficult or fragile or hysterical, that favourite Victorian diagnosis for women experiencing any kind of distress. Some women self-medicated with laudanum, a tincture of opium that was widely available and socially acceptable. It was used for everything from headaches to menstrual cramps to insomnia to general malaise. Many women became addicted without really understanding what was happening. Addiction wasn't understood the way it is now. You just knew that the laudanum made you feel better, made the anxiety and unhappiness more bearable, so you kept taking it. The consequences: increased tolerance, dependence, health problems from long-term opium use were often not recognized until it was too late. Let's return to the question of what these women might have been if they'd been allowed to choose their own paths, because many of them were remarkably talented and intelligent. Jenny Churchill was a gifted writer and political strategist. Consuelo Vanderbilt showed a talent for charitable organization and social reform. Many others had artistic, intellectual, or social gifts that were channeled into being decorative duchesses rather than anything more substantial. Imagine if these women had been able to pursue careers, engage in politics, develop their talents. What might they have achieved? We'll never know, because they were born into a system that didn't recognize those possibilities for women, especially wealthy women of their class. They were supposed to marry well, support their husbands, raise children, and look beautiful while doing it. Any talents or ambitions beyond that were discouraged or suppressed. This is one of the great tragedies of the dollar princess phenomenon. It wasn't just that these women were unhappy in their arranged marriages. It is that they were prevented from becoming fully themselves, from exploring what they might have done with their lives if given freedom and opportunity. They were frozen in the role of ornamental wife, and whatever else they might have been was lost. Some of them seemed to recognize this. In letters and diaries you find expressions of frustration, of feeling that life should be more than an endless round of social obligations and managing households. But they were trapped not just by their specific marriages, but by the whole social system that defined who they could be. Even the most independent-minded among them had limited options for escaping or subverting that system. The few who tried to break free, like Clara Ward, were destroyed by it. The message was clear and reinforced through social mechanisms that were remarkably effective. This is your place. These are your options. Accept it or be ruined. Most women accepted it because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Now let's talk about the modern parallels, because while we'd like to think we've moved past the Gilded Age, some of the dynamics persist in different forms. Think about wealthy families today who still arrange marriages based on business interests or social connections. It happens less openly than in the Gilded Age, but it happens less. Think about the pressure young people, especially young women, face to marry within their class, their religion, their ethnic group. The mechanisms are subtler now: family disapproval rather than literal imprisonment, social consequences rather than legal constraints. But the underlying pressure to sacrifice personal happiness for family interests still exists. Look at modern celebrity marriages, especially those involving extreme wealth. How many marriages between billionaires or between celebrities and wealthy business people are partly about merging empires, building brands, maintaining public images? The language has changed from dowries and titles to prenuptial agreements and business synergies. But the transactional element remains. When a young actress marries a billionaire 50 years her senior, or when two wealthy families unite their children in highly publicized weddings with business implications, we're seeing echoes of dollar princess dynamics. Think about international marriages today, where visa status, citizenship, or access to a particular country's opportunities are part of the calculus. How different is that, really, from American heiresses being shipped to Europe for titles? The specific currency has changed. The woman wants a green card, the man wants companionship or domestic labor, but it is still transactional. It is still a situation where personal choice is constrained by larger forces. Or consider arranged marriages in communities that still practice them. Often these are framed in terms of tradition and culture, and within those communities they may work well, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. Families deciding who their children should marry based on factors beyond the individual's preferences. The young people may have veto power, may be consulted, but they're not entirely free agents. And women in these systems often have less power than men to refuse matches or to leave unhappy marriages. Even in modern Western societies where individual choice in marriage is theoretically absolute, how free are people really? Think about the economic pressures that shape relationship decisions. A woman with student loan debt might be more likely to accept a proposal from a financially stable partner, even if there is no real love, because financial security matters. A man might stay in an unfulfilling marriage because divorce would destroy him financially. These aren't identical to dollar princess marriages, but they're reminders that economic constraints shape romantic choices in ways we don't always acknowledge. Let's talk about the modern versions of the Gilded Cage, because they exist even if they look different. Think about trophy wives in certain wealthy circles. Women who are valued primarily for their beauty and their ability to enhance their husband's status, who live in luxurious homes and have access to wealth, but very little real autonomy or respect. Women who discover that their prenup means they're one divorce away from losing everything, so they stay in relationships that range from unfulfilling to abusive. Women who are isolated from their families and friends by wealthy, controlling partners who use money as a tool of control. Or think about influencer culture and how it creates modern gilded cages. Young women building their entire identities and income streams around their relationships with wealthy partners, creating content about luxury lifestyles that are entirely dependent on their partner's money. What happens if the relationship ends? They lose not just the partner but their brand, their income, their entire constructed identity. That is a different kind of trap than Consuelo Vanderbilt faced. But it is still a situation where wealth and status are purchased at the cost of genuine autonomy and security. Consider the ongoing objectification of wealthy young women in media and society. How often are billionaire or celebrity daughters defined primarily by their wealth, their appearance, and their potential as romantic partners? How often are they reduced to their Instagram followings and their dating lives rather than being recognized for their own accomplishments or interests? The language has changed. We don't call them heiresses seeking dukes anymore, but we still treat some wealthy young women as if their primary value is in who they marry. Let's examine the persistence of transactional marriage more broadly. According to research by sociologists like Christine B. Whelan, assortative mating, the tendency of people to marry others from similar economic and educational backgrounds has actually increased in recent decades. This isn't the same as forced marriages, but it creates a system where economic class is reinforced through marriage patterns. People tend to marry within their class, and this maintains class boundaries across generations. It is subtler than buying aristocratic titles, but it is still a way that marriage functions to maintain and concentrate wealth and status. Think about the modern marriage market in cities like New York, London, Hong Kong, where wealthy individuals intentionally seek out partners of similar economic status. There are dating services that cater specifically to the wealthy, matchmakers who curate introductions between high net worth individuals. The language is about compatibility and shared values, but there is an undeniable economic calculation happening. How different is this really from Gilded Age matchmakers creating catalogues of heiresses and aristocrats? And let's talk about the ongoing pressure women face regarding marriage itself. Even in societies where women have unprecedented freedom and opportunity, there is still social pressure to marry, to have children, to fulfill traditional roles. Women who choose not to marry or not to have children still face questions, judgment, subtle or not. So subtle suggestions that they're missing out or failing at essential womanhood. The pressure is less intense than what Consuelo Vanderbilt faced, but it exists, and for women from traditional or religious families, that pressure can still be overwhelming. Now let's talk about what we can learn from the dollar princesses about autonomy, choice, and the relationship between wealth and freedom, because one of the most important lessons is that money doesn't automatically equal freedom, especially for women. The dollar princesses were among the wealthiest women in the world, but they had less control over their lives than middle-class women with far fewer resources, but more personal freedom. Wealth that you can't control isn't really yours. Status that comes with a cage, however gilded, is still imprisonment. This connects to ongoing conversations about women's economic autonomy. Research consistently shows that economic independence is one of the most important factors in women's ability to leave unhappy or abusive relationships. If you have your own money, your own career, your own resources, you have choices. If all the money in your life belongs to your husband or your family, you are vulnerable. The dollar princesses brought millions to their marriages but couldn't access their own funds. Modern women still face versions of this dynamic when they give up careers to raise children, and then find themselves economically dependent on partners who may or may not have their best interests at heart. Think about the importance of prenuptial agreements from this perspective. They're often framed as unromantic or as planning for failure, but they're also a way of maintaining some financial independence and security. They're a way of ensuring that if you bring assets to a marriage, you retain some control over them. The dollar princesses would have benefited enormously from something like modern prenups, agreements that couldn't be overridden by their husband's desires or the legal presumptions of the era. Let's also think about the dollar princess phenomenon in the context of ongoing debates about women's choices and feminism, because there is a tension in feminist thought about how to regard women who make choices that seem to reinforce traditional gender roles, or that prioritize relationships with men over individual advancement. Should we respect any choice a woman makes, including choosing to be financially dependent on a partner, or to prioritize marriage over career, Or should we be concerned when women's choices are heavily constrained by social pressure, economic necessity, or limited option? The dollar princesses didn't really have choices, so the question doesn't apply to them directly. But their experiences illuminate the importance of asking what constraints shape women's choices. Consuelo Vanderbilt chose to marry the Duke of Marlborough in the technical sense that she said yes, but her choice was made under duress, with her mother literally locking her in her room and threatening to die if Consuelo refused. That is not a meaningful choice, and we can ask similar questions about modern women's choices. Are they made with genuine freedom and full information, or are they made under various forms of pressure and constraint? Let's talk about the intergenerational transmission of these patterns, because one of the saddest aspects of the dollar princess phenomenon is that many of these women who were victims of the system went on to perpetuate it with their own children. Daughters of dollar princesses were often married off in similar fashion, continuing the cycle, and we see this pattern in modern contexts. 2. Parents who experienced controlling or problematic upbringings sometimes reproduce those patterns with their own children, not out of malice, but because it is what they know, what they think is normal or necessary. Breaking intergenerational cycles is hard. It requires recognizing that what happened to you was wrong, even if your parents or grandparents thought it was right. It requires choosing a different path, even when it means going against family expectations or traditions. Some of the dollar princesses managed this. Consuelo Vanderbilt, after her own horrible experience with forced marriage, seems to have allowed her sons more freedom in their own romantic choices. But many others simply replicated the system that had harmed them. Now let's think about the role of mothers in this system, because it is one of the most troubling aspects. Alva Vanderbilt forced her daughter into a miserable marriage, but Alva herself had been married for strategic family reasons. She was perpetuating what had been done to her. This raises difficult questions about complicity and victimhood. Can someone be both a victim of a system and an active participant in perpetuating it? The answer clearly is yes, and that is true in modern contexts too. Mothers who experienced controlling parenting sometimes become controlling parents themselves. Women who accepted limited options in their own lives sometimes enforce similar limits on their daughters. The psychology here is complex. Sometimes it is about cognitive dissonance. If I accept that what was done to me was wrong, I have to confront the pain of that realization and the people who harmed me. It is easier to insist it was right, it was necessary, it was for the best. Sometimes it is about not wanting your suffering to have been meaningless. If you sacrificed your happiness for status or security, seeing your daughter choose differently can feel like an invalidation of your choices. And sometimes it is genuine belief. You really think you are helping. You really believe that security and status matter more than love or personal happiness. But the effect is the same regardless of the motivation. When mothers push their daughters into marriages the daughters don't want, damage is done. And recognizing this pattern in both historical and modern contexts is important. We need to break the cycle of women enforcing patriarchal norms on other women. We need to support each other's autonomy rather than policing each other's choices. Let's talk about what changed to make dollar princess marriages less common, because understanding the end of this phenomenon tells us something about social change more broadly. Several factors converged. First, World War I devastated European aristocracy. Many aristocratic men died. Estates were hit with death duties and taxes. The social prestige of aristocracy declined as democratic and socialist movements gained strength. Titles just didn't have the same cash after the war. Americans didn't need to buy them as much because they didn't confer the same social benefits. Second, American society developed its own sense of confident identity. The nouveau rich of the Gilded Age were insecure, desperate for European validation. But by the 1920s, American culture was asserting itself globally. Hollywood, jazz, American literature and art. These were becoming prestigious in their own right. Being American became something to be proud of rather than something to overcome by acquiring European titles. The cultural cringe that had driven dollar princess marriages eased. Third, and perhaps most importantly, women's rights advanced significantly. Women won the right to vote in 1920 in the US, 1928 in Britain. Women gained more legal rights, more economic opportunities, more social freedom. The idea of forcing a daughter into an unwanted marriage became increasingly unacceptable. Arranged marriages didn't disappear, but the ability to force a truly unwilling woman became more limited. Social expectations shifted toward marriage being a personal choice based on affection rather than family strategy. Fourth, divorce became more socially acceptable. If you were stuck in an unhappy aristocratic marriage in 1895, leaving was nearly impossible. The social and economic consequences were devastating, but by the 1920s and 30s, divorce was still scandalous, but increasingly common and survivable. Women who were unhappy could leave, though it wasn't easy. This changed the calculus of forced marriages. If your daughter could just divorce the Duke a few years later, what was the point of forcing the marriage? These changes didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen everywhere simultaneously, and they haven't fully completed even now. There are still places and communities where forced marriages happen, where young women are pressured into matches they don't want, where economic and social constraints limit choices. But the overall trajectory has been toward greater individual autonomy and less parental control over marriage. What does this tell us about how social change happens? It is not usually one factor but multiple forces working together. Legal changes like women's suffrage, economic changes like women entering the workforce, cultural changes like shifting attitudes about marriage and divorce, technological changes like improvements in communication and transportation that made isolation harder to enforce. All of these together created a world where dollar princess marriages stopped making sense. And this gives us a roadmap for addressing modern forms of constrained choice. Legal reforms are important, ensuring women have property rights, inheritance rights, the right to divorce, access to courts. Economic opportunities matter. Women need to be able to support themselves, so they're not forced into dependence on partners or families. Cultural change is crucial. Shifting norms about what marriage should be, what women's roles are, what autonomy looks like, and practical support, shelters for domestic violence survivors, legal aid for divorces, financial literacy programs. All of these help women exercise autonomy, even when systems still constrain them. Let's talk about memory and how we remember the dollar princesses, because this is important for how we understand both history and our present. For a long time, these women were remembered primarily as lucky girls who got to be duchesses. The emphasis was on the glamour, the beautiful dresses, the magnificent weddings, the titles. The suffering was downplayed or ignored. It is only more recently, as historians have had access to personal letters, diaries, and autobiographies like Consuelo's, that the darker reality has been fully acknowledged. This is a pattern in how we remember women's history generally. The pretty parts are preserved and celebrated. The pain is forgotten or minimized. We remember Cleopatra's beauty and not her political acumen. We remember Marie Antoinette's supposed "let them eat cake" quote, which she never said, and not her actual life as a teenage bride in a foreign court. We remember Jackie Kennedy's pillbox hats and not the trauma she endured. The dollar princesses were remembered as princesses, the fairy tale version, not as the women they actually were. Recovering the full truth of their experiences matters because it changes the story. Instead of a tale of American girls who won the lottery and got to be titled ladies, it becomes a story of systematic abuse disguised as privilege. It becomes a cautionary tale about how wealth without autonomy is meaningless. It becomes a reminder that women's experiences, women's pain, women's perspectives have historically been discounted or erased, and we have to actively work to recover them. This connects to ongoing work in women's history and feminist historiography. For too long, history was written primarily by men, about men, from men's perspectives. Women appeared primarily in relation to famous men, as wives, mothers, daughters. Their own experiences, their own voices were largely absent. Recovering those voices, taking women's own accounts of their lives seriously, recognizing that what looked like success from the outside might have been misery from the inside. This is crucial work. And it applies not just to the past, but to how we understand the present. Whose perspectives are we listening to? Whose experiences are we taking seriously? Whose pain are we acknowledging? Now, let's talk about what the dollar princess phenomenon reveals about the intersection of class and gender. Because these women had class privilege, immense amounts of it, and yet they were still constrained and controlled in ways that reveal the power of patriarchy. They had more wealth than most men could dream of, but they were still subject to male authority, their fathers and then their husbands. Their class privilege couldn't fully protect them from gender oppression. This is an important lesson for understanding how different forms of privilege and oppression interact. You can be privileged in some ways and oppressed in others. The dollar princesses were privileged by wealth, by whiteness, by access to education and culture, but they were oppressed by their gender, by the legal and social systems that gave men control over women, by family structures that treated daughters as property to be disposed of. Their wealth made their cages gilded, but they were still cages. Understanding this helps us think more clearly about modern inequalities. A wealthy white woman and a poor woman of color face very different challenges and have very different levels of privilege, but both can face gender-based oppression, sexual harassment, domestic violence, constrained choices. A wealthy woman's privilege might give her resources to escape an abusive relationship that a poor woman lacks, but she might also face different kinds of pressure to maintain appearances, to avoid scandal, to protect family reputation. Oppression and privilege are complex and intersecting, not simple hierarchies. The dollar princesses also reveal something about the resilience and resistance of women, even in extremely constrained circumstances. These women had almost no power, no real options, no escape routes, and yet many of them found ways to create meaning, to exercise what little agency they had, to survive and sometimes even to thrive within the constraints they faced. Consuelo Vanderbilt eventually divorced and found happiness. Jenny Churchill channeled her energy into politics and writing. Many others threw themselves into charity work, finding purpose in helping others since they couldn't fully help themselves. This resilience is inspiring, but we have to be careful not to romanticize it or use it to excuse the systems that made it necessary. Yes, these women were strong, but they shouldn't have had to be that strong. The fact that they survived and found ways to cope doesn't make what was done to them acceptable. We can honor their strength while still condemning the injustice they faced. And we can recognize that not everyone is that resilient, that some women were destroyed by these marriages. And that is not their failure, it is the system's brutality. Let's talk about one more specific case, that of Catherine Kiki Preston, because her story takes us into the 1920s and shows both how the system was changing and how some elements persisted. Catherine was the daughter of an American father and a British aristocratic mother. She married into British nobility herself in 1919, becoming Lady Lymington, but by the 1920s the old rules were breaking down. Catherine became known for her fast lifestyle, her affairs, her drug use. She was part of a set of young aristocrats who were rebelling against Victorian constraints, embracing modernity, shocking their elders. Catherine's life ended tragically. She struggled with addiction. Her marriage fell apart. She died in 1946 at age 45, having burned through multiple marriages, fortunes, and relationships. Her story is complicated. On one hand, she had freedoms that Consuelo's generation didn't have. She could divorce, remarry, live openly in ways that would have been impossible for women even 20 years earlier. On the other hand, she was clearly deeply troubled, possibly traumatized by the same system that had harmed earlier generations. and she didn't have access to the kind of mental health and addiction treatment that might have helped her. Catherine's story reminds us that freedom without support, without healthy models of how to use it, can be its own kind of tragedy. The women of Consuelo's generation were trapped in rigid expectations. Catherine's generation had more freedom, but often didn't know what to do with it, having never seen healthy examples of women living autonomous lives. This is relevant to modern conversations about women's liberation too. It is not enough to remove constraints. We also need positive models, support systems, and resources to help people thrive with their freedom. As we come to the close of tonight's journey, let's think about what we owe the dollar princesses and women like them across history. We owe them memory. First of all, we owe them the effort to understand their lives honestly, not through the rose-tinted lens of romance, but in all their complexity and pain. We owe them recognition that they were more than decorative objects, that they had thoughts, feelings, desires, talents that were suppressed or channeled into narrow acceptable roles. We owe them the commitment to use the freedoms they didn't have. Every time you choose your own partner based on love rather than family pressure, you are exercising a freedom they were denied. Every time you control your own money, pursue your own career, make your own life choices, you are living a life they couldn't. That is not a reason for guilt. It is a reason for gratitude and determination. Gratitude to the women who came before us, whose suffering and whose resistance gradually opened up possibilities, and determination to protect and expand those freedoms, to never take them for granted, to fight for women who still don't have them. We also owe them solidarity with modern women facing similar constraints, because while the specific forms have changed, the fundamental dynamics of families controlling women, of marriages being economic transactions, of women's autonomy being constrained by social and economic pressure, these haven't fully disappeared. When we see women being forced into marriages they don't want, when we see women trapped in abusive relationships by economic dependence, when we see young women being judged primarily on their potential as wives and mothers, we're seeing echoes of the system that created dollar princesses. Supporting women's autonomy means supporting women's education, so they have knowledge and options. Supporting women's economic independence, so they can support themselves and aren't forced into dependence. Supporting legal reforms that protect women's rights to own property, to divorce, to control their own reproductive lives. Supporting cultural change that respects women's choices and doesn't punish women for being unconventional. All of this honors the memory of the dollar princesses and helps ensure fewer women face similar fates. And we owe them honesty about how far we have and haven't come. Yes, we've made enormous progress. Women in most modern democratic societies have legal rights and social freedoms that would astound the dollar princesses. But we haven't achieved full equality. Women still face pressure to conform to narrow roles. Women still do disproportionate amounts of unpaid domestic labor. Women still face violence and harassment. Women's choices are still constrained in ways that men's aren't. The gilded cages have changed shape, but they haven't entirely disappeared. The dollar princesses teach us to look beneath the surface. A life that looks glamorous from the outside might be miserable from the inside. Wealth and status don't automatically equal happiness or freedom. The prettiest cages are still cages, and the most important freedom is the freedom to shape your own life according to your own values and desires, not according to your family's ambitions or society's expectations. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Consuelo finally free at age 44, marrying the man she chose, living the life she wanted after decades of living the life others imposed on her. Think about all the women whose names we don't know, who endured similar fates and never got to tell their stories. Think about the mothers who perpetuated the system and the daughters who suffered from it. Think about the resilience it took to survive in those beautiful prisons and the courage it took for the few who escaped. And think about the freedoms you have, the choices you can make, the autonomy you exercise. These aren't accidents. They're the result of long struggles of women and men who fought for equality, who challenged unjust systems, who imagined different possibilities. The dollar princesses mostly didn't fight back, at least not openly. They couldn't. The costs were too high, but their suffering, and the gradual recognition that it was suffering, contributed to changes in how we think about marriage, women's rights, and human autonomy. You live in a world they helped create not through their choices, but through what those choices revealed about injustice. Their gilded cages eventually became so obviously unjust that the system couldn't sustain itself. Their pain, once it was acknowledged, became a catalyst for change. That is a cold comfort for them, but it is a legacy nonetheless. They didn't get to live free lives, but they made freer lives possible for those who came after. And finally, remember this. The dollar princesses were told their entire lives that their value lay in their beauty, their breeding, their ability to make a good match. They were told that their happiness didn't matter as much as their family's status. They were told that duty to family trumped personal desire. They were told to be grateful for their gilded cages, to appreciate the luxury even as it suffocated them. And many of them, for years or decades, believed these lies, or at least pretended to, because the cost of rebellion was too high. But some of them eventually found their voices. Consuelo wrote her autobiography and told the truth about her forced marriage. Others, in letters and diaries, recorded their pain for history to discover. They refused to let the official story, the fairy tale of lucky girls who became duchesses, stand unchallenged. They insisted on being remembered as they actually were, human beings who suffered, who endured, who deserved better than they got. We honor them by telling their stories honestly, by acknowledging that the Gilded Age, for all its glamour and excess, was built on deep injustices, including the systematic control and exploitation of wealthy women by their own families. By recognizing that progress towards gender equality has been hard-won and remains incomplete, and by committing ourselves to a world where no one, regardless of gender, is treated as property to be traded, where love matters more than status, where individual happiness is valued above family ambition, and where everyone has the freedom to choose their own path. The dollar princesses were casualties of a system that valued wealth and status above human dignity and happiness. But their suffering wasn't meaningless. It became part of the story of why we changed, why we decided that forcing young women into loveless marriages for social gain was unacceptable, why we fought for women's rights to autonomy and self-determination. Their gilded cages eventually helped us understand why freedom matters more than gold, why the right to choose your own life is the most precious privilege of all. Before we part tonight, think about the small acts of resistance these women managed within their constraints. Think about the American heiress who insisted on serving American Thanksgiving dinner at her British estate, maintaining that connection to home despite her husband's objections. Think about the Duchess who channeled her fortune into scholarships for working-class girls, giving other women opportunities she'd never had. Think about the letters passed between dollar princesses, offering support and understanding to each other when no one else could comprehend their particular loneliness. Think about the woman who quietly taught her daughters that marriage should be a choice, planting seeds for change she wouldn't live to see fully bloom. These weren't grand gestures, they couldn't be. The system was too powerful, the constraints too tight, but they mattered. They were ways of asserting humanity in a system that tried to reduce these women to ornamental transactions. They were ways of maintaining identity when everything pushed toward erasure. They were acts of care and connection in a world designed to isolate and control. And they remind us that even when we can't change systems, we can refuse to let them completely define us. We can find small ways to assert our values, to help others to maintain connections to what matters. The dollar princesses teach us about both the crushing weight of unjust systems and the persistent spark of human agency that survives even in the tightest constraints. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us to look beyond surfaces. When you see wealth, beauty, status, glamour, ask yourself what might be hidden beneath. Ask whose suffering might be supporting that luxury. Ask what constraints might accompany that privilege. The dollar princesses looked from the outside like the luckiest women in the world. Rich beyond measure, beautiful draped in diamonds, married to dukes and princes living in palaces. But from the inside, many of them were profoundly unhappy, trapped, isolated, far from home, married to men who didn't love them, separated from people they loved, denied the basic freedom to shape their own lives. This is true more broadly. The lives that look perfect on Instagram, the relationships that appear ideal from the outside, the successes that seem effortless, they all have hidden costs and complications. We live in an age of performative perfection, where everyone curates their best life for public consumption. But just as the dollar princesses smiled for photographs while dying inside, modern people post carefully filtered images that hide pain, struggle, loneliness, doubt. The lesson is to be kind, to be skeptical of surfaces, to remember that you never really know what someone else is experiencing, and to be honest about your own life, to resist the pressure to pretend everything is perfect when it isn't, to give others permission to be imperfect by being honest about your own imperfections. The dollar princesses matter not just as historical figures, but as reminders of persistent truths about power, gender, wealth, and freedom. They matter because their stories are beautiful and heartbreaking and infuriating all at once. They matter because they were real women who lived complex lives and deserve to be remembered fully, not just as pretty pictures in history books. And they matter because understanding their experiences helps us understand ongoing struggles for autonomy, equality, and the right to self-determination. So tonight, as you finally drift into sleep, carry these women with you. Carry Consuelo, forced into marriage at 18, finding freedom at 44. Carry Anna Gold, watching her fortune disappear into her husband's lavish parties. Carry Mary Leiter, dying at 36, in service to her husband's ambitions. Carry Jenny Churchill, brilliant and ambitious, but channeling it all through men. Carry Clara Ward, choosing scandal over constraint and paying dearly for it. Carry all the nameless, forgotten women whose stories we'll never know, but whose suffering was just as real. Remember them, honor them, use the freedoms they helped make possible, and commit to a world where gilded cages, in whatever form they take, are recognized for what they are and dismantled. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for the freedom to choose your own path, for the right to marry or not marry as you wish, for the ability to shape your own life according to your own values and desires. These rights weren't given freely. They were fought for, often by women who themselves never got to fully enjoy them. The dollar princesses paid a terrible price for a system they didn't create and couldn't escape. We owe it to them to use the freedoms they helped make possible, to never take for granted the right to choose our own futures, and to fight for women everywhere who still face constraints on their autonomy and their choices. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the gilded cages and broken hearts of the Gilded Age. Until next time, rest well, and remember that true wealth is measured not in titles or jewels, but in the freedom to live a life you've chosen for yourself. Good night.